data governance is really the foundation of a lot of topics that we might have heard about this year. When you think about, there's been, in terms of the zeitgeist and what's been on top of people's mind, it's been things such as, 2023 has been the year of efficiency, I think, at Meta. I think everyone I know in the boardroom and companies are having a lot of discussions about digital transformation, as well as the role of AI in every company's future. But really, before you can do transformation or actually drive improved efficiency, or actually get into the AI space, you need a very sound data governance strategy. And it's a topic that sounds fancy, and I'll get into what it is. But I just wanted to tell you that there's a lot of people that still really grappling and trying to get their arms around this topic. One of the things I wanted to maybe share is that I'm on the board, the advisory board for the global advisory board for the Harvard Business School with a lot of the Harvard Business School professors. And, in a lot of the cases that they're writing and they're trying to get their arms around it, it really is about transformation. It's about AI. It's about how to make companies more productive. And what they found is it all comes back and does tie back to data governance and, the topic. And there's so many things that's changing in these spaces that I'm hoping I can provide first a really simple foundational explanation of what this is. And as we go forward, if there's any questions or anything you're unclear about, I think it's okay to ask the questions. So more than happy to answer any open questions you might have. But I'll tell you, in many different corners, from academics to boardrooms to even management teams, I think they're all trying to put their arms around all these things that kind of tie together, but it all comes down to this foundational data strategy that I would say that will drive most of these initiatives. So what is data governance? In a fancy word, it's really what data governance is. It's really an orchestration of the processes, policies, and structures to ensure an efficient, effective use of data within an organization. I would say doing this in a responsible way. And maybe a good way to think about it is it actually involves the people as a framework, if you want to think about it, and the roles and responsibility of the people inside an organization, the policies that are set to make that happen, and then the technology that's used to drive a lot of these transformational topics. That's what it is, but it's really, if you take a step back, it's really just a set of principles that helps an organization to manage your data effectively and safely. Data that's used improperly can expose a company in a bad way, and data that's locked into silos does not allow a company to operate efficiently. So there's this kind of tension and fine balance in an organization. And I do think it's important at the board level, I have the right discussions, at least with the company and the leadership team, to make sure that people understand how data should be used, how data should be safely guarded, and how data can be used in a responsible way to drive the productivity of a business. Does that make sense? Great. So there's really five things I would say. If you think about data governance, it comes down to what data exists inside an organization. Second thing is whether the data is of good quality, and then whether the data is used in a responsible way, and who's using the data and what they're using it for, and then whether the use cases are compliant and governed. Just getting your arms around each of these questions, I think, are going to be really important in terms of taking inventory of how the data works and how data is being used inside an organization. Because what typically we find, or I have found as I've talked to a lot of companies, is that most organizations have these really big vanity metrics, like they capture all this data on their companies. I can't disclose some of these public companies, but they will say that they have terabytes of data that they collect on a daily basis, but they can't use any of it. So they have these big metrics of we have information on every 100% of our consumers, and then when it takes time to, okay, now let's leverage and use this for your business, so you can maybe drive repeat purchases, drive better loyalty, remove waste in your supply chain. Most organizations then scratch their heads and say they can't do it, even though I think the conversation needs to go beyond we've collected the data. The information, then the conversation really needs to turn to how are you using the data, and are you using it in an appropriate way? And that's going to be really key, I think, in terms of really driving the efficiency gains, because if you can unlock this in terms of data, the benefits to an organization leads to productivity gains in all functions, delivers a higher sense of sales and productivity, and will drive higher customer loyalty as well. Now, the key thing in terms of doing this is that you might want to follow or think about the unlocking in this governance process, similar to how organizations sometimes work in silos, and if those silos are productive for the organization or not. Because a big part of the governance process is really making sure that the data is being able to be accessible by the largest amount of people in a very responsible way, so everyone can do their job. It may be, if it was in retail, the store clerk that needs to understand when a new inventory of an item they've been out of is coming in, to a transportation company understanding when they're shipping something across the ocean, where that item and should they buy more, to really driving and leveraging data in the right way so you can produce the right products for future R&D for your customers as you build up your R&D pipeline. So I'll tell you why data is this topic. I think everyone understands the importance of data, but when you think about it, as we go through a lot of the transformation, data is really the currency of digital transformation. It's really the key enabler, in fact, of how a lot of value for companies are going to be created in the future term. And it goes beyond just actually having a lot of data, but being able to access it in ways that's actionable. And that's really what data governance is really about. But what's interesting is, I know this chart might be a little difficult to read. It's a McKinsey data, it's a recent McKinsey survey, where what they found is inside most organizations, on average, about 30% of total enterprise time was spent on non-value tasks because of poor quality. So I'm going to repeat that. About almost a third of tasks that exist inside companies are being used on unproductive things because of poor quality. And you can see there in operations and in finance and in risk, they're actually even higher. So it's pretty startling when you think about how inefficient organizations are. And I can tell you, I'm sure if we had a raise of hands, you will find a lot of organizations, as I pointed out before, talking about how much data they have. But when you talk about how much of that data can you translate to into action, a lot of companies really do struggle with that. So data governance affects the entire organization in terms of how it's run. And companies that have underdeveloped data governance can be exposed to costly regulatory and consumer risk. One of the things to worry about is, if you don't have a great data governance strategy, if you get into AI and you use it for consumer scoring as an example, your company can be considered liable for bias. So it's really important to get your arms around this. And I would say, as we look out, data governance is really going to be one of the top 3 differences between firms that can capture value from data and firms that don't. And then there's a lot of future growth opportunities, including AI, that are dependent on a robust and agile I would say, data platform as well as data governance. What it ensures is that if your firms want to get into AI in a big way, you want to make sure that the AI is accessible and it's usable and it's used at the enterprise level. So it's not just optimizing one function, but that function, if they have insights, is being used appropriately by other organizations or other functions inside a company. Now, I'll quickly, because I know we have a limited amount of time, the challenges in terms of driving effective data governance is the fact that organizations typically, when the topic of data governance comes up, it's handed from the leadership down to a middle manager inside the organization to make these governance calls. They can also be in a situation where data inside an organization is not shared. So for instance, customer information inside sales and marketing is not shared with a product or engineering team, or it's not shared with supply chain. So it prevents the organization at the enterprise level to be able to be optimized that way. And what you will realize as you think about data governance, it's like anything else. The most important thing is not optimizing a function inside an organization, but really optimizing the enterprise so that you can drive incremental gains in profit and sales. And then, the other challenge is thinking through how to protect your data from unauthorized use or used in ways that don't comply with regulation. But it does all really start with a clear data governance framework. And it really goes back to asking the questions about, how is that your data currently being used and who's using it, and also what you're looking to achieve with your initiatives. So the key criteria, I'll say there's 6 key criteria to driving efficiency with data governance. And it comes down to these 6 things, which is the first thing that needs to happen is an effective data governance strategy requires buy-in and prioritization from senior leadership inside the company. It's the same thing as digital transformation, by the way. You can't have a CEO saying it's really important and handing down to their junior manager, and the CEO doesn't ever check back in. It needs to be counted as one of the company's high priorities, so that everyone in the organization understands that data needs to be used in an appropriate, responsible way, but also needs to be shared in a responsible way inside the organization. The second thing, as part of its key in terms of effective data governance strategy, is really to make sure that your data governance and whatever strategy you select is integrated with your primary transformation themes, so that your data will support whatever transformational themes your organization is focused on. And it just can't be an empty promise of a goal out there, but really, leverage it. And if the organization's competency is not there, make sure it's part of the transformation initiative so it becomes usable by those groups over time. And then third is prioritizing data assets and focus on data leaderships in terms of who owns it and who doesn't, applying the right level of governance and really audits, make sure based on the complexity and regulation on this. I think the best plan is really to really understand this. The most successful it is to drive the business outcomes you want. You want to make sure that you democratize the data as much as you can, while guarding the security of some of the data that you might consider proprietary. But it's definitely needs to be looked at from just like transformation, from goals rather by departmental functions. And then the other thing is try to choose in terms of data governance, use real life examples and focus on implementation plans that are focused on small goals. I think the thing sometimes that happens when companies try to build up their data governance is that they take on these massive initiatives and they say we must do that. That's the first project we're going to focus on in terms of how we govern data. And usually those fail because what you want to do is you want to launch something that's bite-sized, easy use, have the organization build momentum, learn from it, and then you apply larger programs to your data governance program as you roll this thing out across the organization. So you use momentum and confidence inside the organization to do that. And then, finally, I think the last thing is really generating excitement for data inside the organization. I know a lot of people inside the organization will say they're data driven, but really data is a thing that I think some people use the term data as the new oil, or it's like the new electricity. It will power a large majority of the competitive advantages that most organizations have if you do AI or not, because the biggest difference is when you think about most organizations is there's a lot of things that your competitors can copy, but based on the data that you have, you might interpret it differently. And based on that, it's going to provide you with different level of competitive advantage that maybe people you compete with will not have. I know a lot of different materials. I had a short amount of time. I think I got through this in about 22 minutes. As we kick it off into the breakout groups, there's going to be a few questions that we have here in your discussion. I think one is, what is an appropriate data governance framework that makes it clear how and what data is being collected, stored, managed, and used, and who makes these decisions? And these discussions are really meant for the management team to make, but I think it's important for a board member to be able to talk to the CEO and the leadership team so that you understand how these things are being used, because it's important to challenge some of the assumptions, because it's easy inside an organization for a lot of this data to get locked up in silos. So it's important for the board to work with the CEO to make sure that the organization unlocks that, because that's where the opportunities are going to be at. And then inside organizations, thinking about a governance framework, which business leaders are really responsible for data governance. Sometimes data is responsible by, I think, 30 different teams. And if you have the right framework, you kind of simplify that and make sure everyone in the organization knows who is the owner of that data, how it's being used, and then how you can use it for your own transformation efforts, your AI initiatives, as well as anything else you want to do in terms of building new businesses. Some organizations have a CIO or chief compliance officer that uses this. I think that I've seen more success when this sits with a CIO as one of the leading board members with participation from large majority of the business function leaders, including the CEO, in terms of checking in versus letting it go rogue. If it's on the compliance side, what typically I've seen is that it's sometimes overly heavily regulated and data gets more locked in silos or not being used. And it does depend on the business. So you'll want to think about, if your business is heavily regulated, let's say like a bank, you might need to put on more guardrails, but go through the use cases of how these things get used. And then, how as an organization, you guys can use this data in an appropriate and safe way. And then finally, the last thing is what committee structure would bring the right focus and attention to cybersecurity, which is one of the focus as you make some of this data more readily available, making sure that you protect, obviously, privacy of your consumers as well as your employees, and making sure that the data is being used for ethical ways. And the data is, when you say hygiene, it means it's usable, because a lot of times, going back to the example I used, it's not. So I'll just kind of stop right there exactly at at 25 after, and see if maybe if there's any questions. If not, we can go on.
So first of all, Anthony, thank you so much. And there are a ton of questions in the chat. So I'm going to just pick one or two because I do want to allow enough time to go into the breakouts. And what I would suggest in the breakouts is that you prioritize kind of which question you want to tackle first. I don't know that we'll have enough time to do all three. This is such robust information, Anthony, and obviously very thought-provoking for everyone. So thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Like I said, we will send this out to everybody so you have those notes. So let me just kind of pick a couple here. And I think I'm trying to pick out ones that I don't think will have like a 15-minute answer, because I think there's just so much to do. But one of them is, obviously with the acceleration of AI, I mean, is this in terms of a board priority, do you see this as something that people really need to get their arms around in the near term, like over the next 6 to 12 months, and get some of these infrastructure pieces put in? And if so, what kind of KPIs are out there that you've seen that are effective and really kind of monitoring this really broad field going forward? So I think those are kind of two questions combined into one, but I thought those were good kind of general ones that we could ask you.
Yeah. And by the way, I think that the feeling there that this is such a robust topic, trying to go over in 25 minutes, we had to gloss over, but hopefully it provides everyone a kind of foundational understanding. The question of AI is really interesting. And I think I was in a session with Barbara maybe earlier in the summer when we started talking about AI. And what I would say is that most organizations, if you are even thinking about using AI in your future, data governance is the first step you need to take. And the reason being, is that all AI does is AI mimics human behavior in many respects, especially now. So if your organization is inefficient, okay, all AI is going to do is accentuate your inefficiency. So if you're inefficient, if the organization's inefficient or a function's inefficient, it's going to make that function even more inefficient with AI. And when you think about an organization that's more efficient, then AI magnifies that and makes an organization even more efficient. So when you think about AI, it comes down to there's three parts that's differentiated that drives AI. One is the processing power of in terms of what they call compute, which is really the raw horsepower. A lot of people are using NVIDIA GPUs or the hardware that's kind of driving that AI. The second piece is your algorithms. And a lot of people are using off-the-shelf open source algorithms where they're leveraging something at AWS or at Microsoft Azure. But the thing that most companies bring to the table with AI is their data. So the data is the content that feeds into the compute and the algorithms. So if you don't have clean data and you don't have data that the AI can make sense of, then you're going to spend a lot of money and get very little return. As I mentioned, you can't expect that overnight you turn this on and you're going to see your organization operating something like ChatGPT. But what you need to do is start taking a step. So maybe what I would say is let's focus on the idea of trying to make drive customer loyalty in the West Coast of your organization, and using data in the right way to do that, just using a very specific use case. Then what you want to do is say, okay, what are the ways the data is being held up for the organizations that you need to use that case? So really going through a very specific use case, and then figuring out and making decisions in terms of how that data then needs to be governed in terms of access, things you want to hold back, how often the data needs to be cleaned. And you'll understand as an organization where the roadblocks are, because there's roadblocks when you first look at it. It's like any organization, you're going to find that there's old policies that's been laid into place that are preventing you from being transformed in the future. Hopefully that was not too long of an answer, but I wanted to make sure people had the context.